Before the flood, before the kingdoms, before the names we were permitted to remember, there were others. Angels who crossed a threshold no divine law had ever anticipated, and one of them has been almost completely erased from the record. His name is Sariel. In some manuscripts, Suriel. In others, Saracael. He is listed among the Watchers, the Hirin, those divine sentinels assigned to observe humanity. And he did something the others did not. Most of the Watchers who descended on Mount Hermon are remembered as corruptors, as destroyers, as the source of the violence that made God open the heavens and drown the world. But Sariel occupies a different position in the oldest texts. The first book of Enoch places him among both the fallen and the holy. He teaches the courses of the moon, secret celestial knowledge, and yet his name echoes in the same lists as the archangels who remained faithful. How is that possible? Tonight we enter the Book of the Watchers, one of the oldest forbidden texts in existence. And we follow Sariel into the shadows of collective memory. We will find not an invented absolution, but something stranger, a trajectory the scribes could not quite erase. You are about to encounter a figure who stood at the edge of both worlds, the fallen and the faithful, and whose story reveals something profound about how divine memory works. Some names endure as warnings. Sariel endured as something else. The story they erased not about sin alone, it is about memory, transmission, and what happens when a name persists across centuries, even when the institution that preserved it would prefer silence. Sariel persisted. We do not invent verses. We do not add to what the ancients wrote. We only read what they left, carefully, reverently, and we follow where those words lead. This is the story of Sariel, the watcher who history could not decide how to condemn. To understand Sariel, you must first understand the world into which he descended. Not the world of temples and kings that would come later, but an earlier world, raw and mythic, barely separated from the moment of creation. The first book of Enoch, written in Aramaic and preserved most completely in Ethiopic J's translation, opens a window onto this world that the canonical scriptures deliberately closed. The Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36 of Enoch, is among the oldest sustained angelic literature we possess. Fragments of it were recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirming that at least some of its contents circulated in the Second Temple period, perhaps as early as the 3rd century BCE. This was not marginal literature. It was read, copied, and treasured. The community at Qumran preserved multiple copies. The early Christian writer Jude quotes from it directly. Before it became forbidden, it was foundational. In this world, the boundary between heaven and earth was understood to be permeable. Angels, the Malachim, the messengers, the divine council of El Elyon, moved between realms with a freedom that later theology would anxiously restrict. The Watchers, the Iron in Aramaic, occupy a specific category in this cosmology. The Hebrew root ear means to watch, to be awake, to be vigilant. These were divine beings whose function was to observe, to be the eyes of heaven turned toward the human world below. The book of Daniel uses this same term for a holy one who descends. In Daniel 4:13, a watcher comes down from heaven, awake and luminous, while the human world sleeps. But the watchers of Worst Enoch are doing more than observing. They are watching human women, and watching, in this context, becomes something that corrupts the observer. The boundary between divine vigilance and forbidden desire is, it turns out, very thin. 1 Enoch 6:1-2 is direct. And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them. The text then names their leader, Semyaza, who is afraid. He tells his companions that he alone will bear the guilt of this transgression. They swear an oath together, binding themselves collectively to the descent. This is the famous compact on Mount Hermon, whose name the text connects etymologically to the word for oath, herem, the thing devoted to destruction. They consecrated their transgression with a covenant. The mountain itself became the monument of their mutual agreement to cross the line that divine law had drawn between their nature and human nature. And among those who swore that oath, the text lists a name, Sariel. Other manuscripts render it Sariel or Suriel. He is there, on the mountain, in the moment of the oath. He descends with the others. The name Sariel itself carries meaning that deserves attention. Scholars of ancient Hebrew and Aramaic generally parse it as a compound. Sar, meaning prince or ruler, and El, the divine name, Prince of God, Commander of God. Some variant readings point toward a slightly different parsing. Sariel, where the sar relates to a verb of turning or of watching from a height. The name Sariel, the variant found in some Enoch manuscripts, adds Quael, possibly connecting to the concept of oversight or governance of divine persons. Whatever the precise etymology, the name places him in the nobility of the divine host. He is not a minor spirit. He is a prince-rank being, a member of what one Enoch elsewhere describes as the highest tier of the heavenly hierarchy. That such a being was present at the oath on Hermon is significant. He was not dragged there by peer pressure. He was a leader among leaders who chose to descend. Yet before we condemn him alongside Semyaza and Azazel, the tradition asks us to pause. What exactly is Sariel accused of teaching? 1 Enoch chapter 8 assigns specific forbidden knowledge to specific watcher leaders. Azazel taught humanity to make swords and shields, to forge armor, to perfect the instruments of war. He taught women to use rouge and eye paint, the arts of seduction in the text's moral framework. Semyaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Others taught astrology, augury, the art of the blow. These are all presented as corrupting transmissions, knowledge that accelerated violence and magic, and the distortion of nature. But when Sariel, listed as Sariel in 1 Enoch 8:4, is assigned his forbidden teaching, the text says something notably different. He taught the courses of the moon, the motions of the moon, the lunar calendar. This distinction, small as it may seem, becomes extraordinarily significant when you trace the thread through centuries of tradition. The moon is not, in the ancient Near Eastern world, a morally neutral object. It is one of the great timekeepers of sacred life. The Hebrew lunar calendar, the foundation of every festival in the Torah, every Sabbath rhythm, every observance from Passover to Yom Kippur, depends entirely on the accurate tracking of the moon's courses. The months of the Hebrew year are lunar months: Tishri, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tevet. The festivals are pinned to specific moon phases. New moon celebrations, Rosh Chodesh, are commanded in Numbers 28:11. At the beginnings of your months, you shall offer a burnt offering to the Lord. The moon is not an astrological curiosity. It is a liturgical necessity. It is how the community knows when to gather, when to fast, when to sacrifice, when to rest. Without accurate knowledge of the moon's courses, sacred time collapses. The covenant community loses its temporal anchor in the cosmos. So when Worcester Enoch assigns to Sariel the teaching of the moon's courses, what is actually being transmitted? The text presents it within a list of corrupting forbidden knowledges. The framework is one of transgression, of heaven's secrets spilling into human hands before their time. The author of 1 Enoch clearly intends this as a condemnation. And yet, the content of the teaching is not demonic. It is liturgical. It is sacred. Knowing the courses of the moon is not knowing how to make a sword. It is not knowing how to mix poison. It is knowing how to track sacred time, the very knowledge that the entire Mosaic calendar depends upon. This ambiguity is not accidental. It reflects a real tension in the ancient world's understanding of celestial knowledge. Was it sacred wisdom given by God to humanity through proper channels? Or was it esoteric power seized through transgression? The Enochic tradition, concerned with the latter, places the lunar teaching in the forbidden column, but the content keeps slipping through the framework. The contrast with other Watcher teachings becomes even starker when you consider the consequences described in Forfeiture 1 Enoch 8 and 9. The violence that follows from the other teachings is immediate and catastrophic. Azazel's weapons produce war. His cosmetics produce seduction and spiritual corruption. Semyaza's enchantments produce sorcery. The Nephilim, the giants born from the union of Watchers and human women, consume the food of humanity, then consume humanity itself, then begin devouring one another. 1 Enoch 7-325 describes the Nephilim turning against humanity in an escalating frenzy of violence. The earth cries out. Blood soaks the ground. The sound of the earth's suffering reaches heaven in chapter 9, where the archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, look down and hear the groaning. They bring the complaint to God. The transgression has produced a catastrophe of blood and violence. In this tableau of carnage, the teaching of the moon's courses seems conspicuously abstract. It is a celestial fact, not a weapon. The astronomical book of Enoch, chapters 72-82 of 1st and 3rd Enoch, develops the lunar teaching further, and in ways that explicitly sanctify it. In this section, the angel Uriel serves as guide and instructor, walking Enoch through the laws governing the sun, moon, stars, and seasons. The moon's phases, its waxing and waning, its relationship to the solar calendar, all of this is treated not as forbidden knowledge, but as cosmic order revealed through divine instruction. The astronomical book positions accurate celestial knowledge as foundational to proper religious observance. The 364-day solar calendar defended in this section is presented as the divinely ordained calendar, the one that keeps the festivals properly aligned with the heavenly order. Here, the same knowledge, the courses of celestial bodies, appears not as transgression, but as revelation. The text cannot quite decide whether knowing the moon's path is sacred or forbidden. That ambivalence surrounds Sariel like a persistent shadow. There is another tradition associated with Sariel that must be addressed here: healing. In several versions of the Jewish magical tradition, the name Sariel, which scholars widely identify with Sariel, appears as an angel of healing and protection. The Sefer Harazim, the Book of Mysteries, a text of ancient Hebrew origin that survives in medieval copies but contains material of much earlier provenance, invokes angelic names in contexts of healing and protection. Sariel appears in contexts connected with guarding against harmful spirits and with the protection of the sick. The Aramaic incantation bowls discovered in Mesopotamia, archaeological artifacts dated to the Sassanid period, 5th through 7th centuries CE, but drawing on earlier traditions, sometimes invoke angelic names including variants of Sariel or Suriel in protective formulas. This is not evidence of canonical status, but it is evidence of persistent popular veneration. Ordinary people, across centuries, remembered this angel's name and associated it with protection, not with destruction. 1 Enoch chapter 9 is one of the most remarkable passages in all of ancient angelology. The four archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, stand at the edge of heaven and look down. They see the blood. They hear the cries of humanity and of the earth itself. The text says in 9:2-3, "And they said to one another, the earth made without inhabitant cries, the voice of their crying up to the gates of heaven. And now to you, the holy ones of heaven, the souls of men make their suit, saying, Bring our cause before the Most High." The archangels then do something. They intercede. They bring the complaint of suffering humanity before the throne of God. This moment is the pivot of the entire book of the Watchers. The transgression has produced consequences so catastrophic that even the divine messenger class must appeal upward to the highest tier. God's response will determine the fate of every watcher who descended on Hermon. God's response in chapters 10 and 11 of Varserts. Enoch is precise and differentiated, and the differentiation matters enormously. The Most High does not issue a single blanket condemnation. He sends 4 separate messages to 4 separate archangels, each with specific instructions concerning specific watcher leaders. To Raphael, bind Azazel hand and foot, cast him into the darkness of the desert of Dudael, cover him with jagged rocks, let him remain there until the day of judgment, when he shall be thrown into fire. The text in 10:6-8 specifies that all sin was ascribed to Azazel. He is the primary vessel of corruption. To Gabriel, proceed against the offspring of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and destroy them. Let them fall by one another's hands in mutual destruction. To Michael, bind Semyaza and his companions in the valleys of the earth for 70 generations, until the judgment of eternity. The punishments are specific, they are named, and they are severe. Chains, darkness, imprisonment under the mountains until the final judgment. Now here is what the text does and does not say about Sariel. In the great judgment passage of chapters 10 and 11, Sariel, is not among those individually named for punishment. The text names Semyaza. It names Azazel, who receives the harshest condemnation. All sin was ascribed to him. It names others in its lists of the 200. But in the specific divine directives, in the precise angelic assignments to go and bind and destroy, the name Sariel does not appear as a target. This is an argument from silence, and it must be treated carefully. The text is not comprehensive. Not every name receives individual treatment. The silence does not mean he escaped punishment, but combined with everything else, the nature of his teaching, his later appearances in archangel lists, the healing traditions that attach to his name, the silence takes on the weight of accumulated evidence. Something about Sariel's trajectory and collective memory differs from Azazel's. The tradition remembers the difference even when it struggles to articulate it. The intercession passage in chapter 13 is also instructive. After God has issued the divine judgment, the Watchers, the fallen ones, ask Enoch to write a petition on their behalf and present it before the throne. Enoch does so. He reads the petition at the waters of Dan and falls asleep and is taken in a vision before the divine throne. The answer he receives in chapter 14 is devastating. There will be no peace for them. They had dwelled in heaven and known the Holy One. Therefore, they have no intercession and no mercy. The text says in 14:4-5, Ye have not maintained your holy and eternal existence, but you have defiled yourselves with women, and with the blood of flesh-begotten children, and you have lusted after flesh and blood, as do mortals. The judgment is collective in its framing. But notice, the Watchers are asking for intercession. They know they have transgressed. They are appealing to the system of divine mercy they once served. This detail, that they appeal rather than merely endure, will matter when we follow Sariel's name into later tradition. The differentiation in the text's treatment of Watcher leaders reflects a theological concern with graduated culpability. Not all transgression is equal. Azazel, who taught all unrighteousness on earth, 1 Enoch 9-6, and who introduced the instruments of war, receives the designation of primary bearer of human sin. He is the scapegoat in a literalized cosmological sense, the one upon whom the most extreme weight of collective transgression is placed. Semyaza receives severe judgment as the organizer of the oath, the leader who dragged 200 divine beings into rebellion. The cosmic chain of causation runs through him as political architect of the fall. Others receive proportional treatment. The gradations matter. This is a text deeply concerned with the question of how divine justice handles collective transgressions that have individual variations. And Sariel's individual variation, his specific contribution of lunar knowledge rather than weapons or sorcery, is part of what the tradition has remembered, however imperfectly, across centuries of transmission. Here is the most extraordinary fact about Sariel, the one that makes his story genuinely strange, and that no simple narrative of fallen angel punishment can fully contain. His name appears not only in the lists of fallen watchers, but also in the lists of the holy archangels who remained faithful. 1 Enoch chapter 20, which provides one of the oldest systematic lists of named archangels in Jewish literature, reads as follows in the Standard Translation. The text names Uriel, who is over the world, and Tartarus; Raphael, over the spirits of men; Raguel, who takes vengeance on the world; Michael, who is set over the best part of mankind and over chaos; Sariel, who is set over the spirits who sin; Gabriel, who is over paradise and the serpents and the cherubim; and Remiel, whom God set over those who rise. 7 archangels, holy, standing, faithful. And one of them is named Sariel, the same name that appears in the list of watchers who swore the oath on Mount Hermon. The scholarly discussion around this double appearance has not been fully resolved. There are several interpretive possibilities. First, Sariel the archangel and Sariel the fallen watcher are entirely different beings who happen to share a name, a scribal coincidence, or a case of overlapping naming traditions. Second, the list in chapter 20 represents a different source tradition within the composite text of 1 Enoch, one that had not yet integrated the Watcher narrative and preserved an older list of 7 archangels in which Sariel had always been holy. Third, and most theologically complex, the tradition preserved a memory of Sariel as occupying both positions, as having descended and yet having been, in some sense, restored, or at least not finally and permanently condemned in the way that Azael was condemned. None of these explanations is fully satisfying. What is certain is that the text, in its final composite form, contains both references without resolving the contradiction. The ancient scribes left the tension standing. They did not erase one reference to clean up the other. The role assigned to Sariel in 1 Enoch 20 is also remarkable. He is set over the spirits who sin. This is a position of moral oversight within the divine economy. He is the archangel responsible for those who transgress. The being who himself transgressed, or who bore the same name as one who transgressed, is assigned to govern the spiritual fate of sinners. The irony is so profound that it seems almost intentional. A watcher who crossed the line becomes, in the archangel tradition, the guardian of the line itself, the overseer of the souls who have fallen into sin. If this is the same being, or if it reflects a tradition that understood him as somehow rehabilitated into the divine hierarchy, then what we are looking at is the oldest recorded instance in Western religious literature of something resembling a concept of divine rehabilitation for a transgressing celestial being. Not absolution, not forgiveness in the simple sense, but reintegration into the divine order through the assignment of precisely the role that makes most sense, given what he had experienced. So, to appreciate the weight of this tradition, you need to understand how rare named archangels are in the canonical Hebrew scriptures. the Hebrew Bible names only two angels definitively, Michael and Gabriel. Daniel 10:13 names Michael as one of the chief princes, and Daniel 8:16 and 9:21 name Gabriel as messenger. That is the entire canonical roster. By contrast, Wurster's Enoch chapter 20's list of 7 is an expansion of extraordinary significance. This sevenfold archangel tradition became enormously influential. It fed into the angelology of later Jewish texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and into early Christian literature, where the book of Revelation references the 7 angels who stand before God in 8:2 without naming them, clearly drawing on a known tradition. The Book of Tobit, accepted as canonical by Catholic and Orthodox Christians, names Raphael. The tradition knows of 7. And in most early versions of the 7, the name Sariel, Suriel, or Sarakel appears. He is not an afterthought. He is one of the 7 who stand before God. The Islamic tradition, which preserves considerable material from Jewish angelological sources through the Hadith literature and Quranic commentary, includes a figure named Israfil, who shares characteristics with Sariel, or Suriel, most notably the association with the final trumpet, with the resurrection of the dead, with the transition between death and judgment. The overlap is not perfect, and the traditions diverge significantly. But scholars of comparative angelology have noted the connection. Across the 3 Abrahamic traditions, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, there persists a memory of an angelic being whose domain touches the moon, the dead, the sinners, and the transition between states of existence. The precise name shifts. The precise attributes shift. But the outline of a figure at the threshold, between sin and redemption, between death and judgment, between the fallen and the faithful, remains remarkably consistent. Something about this angelic role required a name, and for much of the tradition, that name was Sariel. So, if Sariel was present in so many traditions, in the Watcher narrative, in the archangel lists, in the magical healing literature, in comparative angelological traditions across multiple faiths, then why is he so little known today? Why, when people list the archangels, do they say Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, and stop there, or perhaps add Metatron, but almost never Sariel? The answer lies in a specific historical process, the systematic narrowing of the acceptable angelic canon. The Mishnah, the rabbinic compilation of Jewish oral law, completed around 200 CE, reflects a deepening rabbinic anxiety about angelology in the period after the destruction of the Second Temple. The proliferation of angelic names, the invocation of specific angels in prayer and ritual, these came to be seen as dangerous, as compromising the absolute sovereignty of God, as potential openings for idolatry. The rabbis did not eliminate angels from Jewish theology, but they severely restricted the named, individualized, invocable angel in formal religious practice. The Council of Laodicea in 363 CE addressed the Christian side of this process directly. Canon 35 of that council stated that Christians should not name angels, implying that the naming of specific angels in prayer and liturgy had become sufficiently widespread to require institutional correction. The move against individual angel naming reflected a theological concern. If you can name and invoke a specific angel, that angel begins to function as an independent mediatory power, potentially competing with the singular mediation of Christ in Christian theology, or with the undivided sovereignty of God in Jewish theology. The named angel is the dangerous angel, and so the canon was narrowed. Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael survived the narrowing. They were too deeply embedded in canonical scripture to remove. But the others, Uriel, Sariel, Ragel, Remiel, were progressively pushed to the margins. The Catholic Church officially restricted veneration to the three scripturally named archangels. The others became effectively unofficial. The suppression of Verstrefor Enoch itself is a separate and parallel process. The Book of the Watchers, despite its enormous influence in the Second Temple period, was not included in the Hebrew Bible canon as eventually standardized. The process by which the Hebrew canon was defined, still debated by scholars, with the Council of Jamnia in 90 CE, often mentioned though its role is now contested, effectively excluded the Enochic corpus. The Book of Enoch survived in the canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which is why we have the most complete version of Ferndied Enoch today. The Ethiopic J.A.'s translation made from earlier Aramaic originals, some of which were then independently recovered from Qumran. But in the traditions that shaped European Christianity and normative rabbinic Judaism, whereas Enoch was not scripture, it was Apocrypha. It was outside the boundary. And with it went the richest source for Sariel's story. The suppression of the text and the suppression of the name reinforced each other across centuries. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovery at Qumran between 1947 and 1956 changed everything. Among the hundreds of scrolls preserved in the dry desert caves near the shore of the Dead Sea were multiple fragments of one Enoch in Aramaic, the language closer to the original composition than the Ethiopic translation. The Qumran community, which most scholars identify as a form of Second Temple Judaism with strong apocalyptic and priestly concerns, preserved these texts with evident care. They were not marginalia. They were among the most frequently attested texts in the collection. The Aramaic Enoch fragments allow scholars to compare against the Ethiopic translation, to identify scribal variants, to reconstruct what the original texts may have said. And in those fragments, the name that appears in the Watcher lists and the Archangel lists is recovered from 2,000 years of desert silence. Sariel was there all along. He was waiting in the cave. The suppression was never quite complete. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, which preserved Varnpurst Enoch in its complete form, also preserved a richer theological memory of the seven archangels than the traditions that excluded the Enochic canon. Ethiopian iconography depicts seven archangels by name. Sariel, sometimes rendered Sarakel or Sarakael, appears in that tradition as a legitimate member of the divine company. Not the most prominent, not the most frequently invoked, but present. This has made Ethiopian Christianity one of the few living religious traditions in the world that has consistently maintained a named place for Sariel within its formal angelology. The tradition that preserved the text also preserved the angel. The connection is not coincidental. When you carry the Book of the Watchers in your scriptural canon, you are forced to reckon with Sariel in a way that traditions which excluded the text are not. The Ethiopian Church did not resolve the double appearance, fallen watcher and archangel, but it did not erase it either. It held the tension. Let us pause here and consider what we have actually accumulated. We have a named angel, Sariel, Sarakael, who appears in the oldest sustained angelic literature of the Jewish tradition, in a specific moment of transgression on Mount Hermon. His specific transgression is the teaching of the moon's courses, celestial, sacred knowledge, not a weapon or a dark art. He is not individually named in the divine judgment passages as a target of punishment in the way Azael and Semyaza are. His name appears in Varsed Enoch chapter 20 as one of the seven holy archangels standing before God, assigned the domain of governance over sinners. His name attaches to healing and protection traditions across centuries of popular religious practice. His name persists in the Ethiopian canonical tradition as a holy archangel, and the ambiguity of his double appearance is never resolved in the texts. It is left open, held in tension, as if the tradition recognized that the resolution would require a theological sophistication it had not yet developed. What does this pattern mean? The pattern suggests that the category of the fallen is more porous than the tradition usually admits. The canonical story of the Watchers, the one absorbed into the cultural memory even of people who have never read First Enoch, is a story of absolute, irrevocable fall. 200 angels descended on Hermon. They corrupted humanity. They produced the Nephilim. They brought violence into the world. God judged them. They are bound in darkness until the final judgment. The end. This is a clean narrative. It serves the theological function of explaining the origin of evil without implicating the divine. The Watchers are the fall guys of cosmic history. But Sariel refuses to stay inside this clean narrative. His name keeps leaking out of the fallen category and into the holy category. His teaching keeps being distinguished from the other forbidden teachings by its specifically sacred content. His domain in the archangel tradition, oversight of sinners, positions him as one who bridges the fallen and the governed. The clean narrative has a crack, and Sariel lives in the crack. The Hebrew concept of teshuvah, return, repentance, turning back, is central to the moral theology of the Hebrew Bible. It applies to human beings with explicit force. The possibility of return from transgression is repeatedly affirmed in the prophets, in the Psalms, in the law codes themselves. What the tradition almost never addresses is whether teshuvah applies to angelic beings. The fallen Watchers in 1 Enoch 13-16 are told clearly, "There is no mercy for you. You are not like humans. You were in heaven. You knew the Holy One. You left of your own will. The door to return is closed." But this is a text written in a specific theological context, with specific concerns about the danger of associating heavenly beings too closely with the capacity for divine mercy, a capacity that might then be exploited to diminish the seriousness of the transgression. The text's absolute judgment serves a rhetorical function. Whether it represents the only possible theological conclusion is a different question, and one that later traditions implicitly questioned by continuing to place Sariel's name in the holy column. The category of the Sar, the divine prince, the angelic ruler, in ancient Near Eastern cosmology, was not primarily a category of absolute moral status. It was a category of function and appointment. Michael is the Sar of Israel, Daniel 10:21, 12.1. The divine princes of the nations are a real category in Deuteronomy 32.8 in the Dead Sea Scrolls reading, "When the Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the divine sons." These divine sons, these Sar-level beings, hold their positions by divine appointment. The question of whether such an appointment can be revoked or restored, or whether the being can be reassigned to a new function after a transgression. This is the theological space that Sariel inhabits. The archangel tradition that places him over the spirits who sin may be doing something subtle. It may be reflecting a tradition in which a being who had knowledge of transgression from the inside was judged most fit to govern the realm of transgression from the outside. The poacher turned gamekeeper, the sinner given custody of sinners. There is a concept in Kabbalistic Jewish mysticism, developed most fully in the Zohar and in later texts, but drawing on much older roots, of the spark that falls into the realm of the kelipot, the shells or husks of spiritual darkness, and that must be recovered and returned to its source. The theology of divine sparks scattered through the lower realms, awaiting their return to unity with the divine light, is part of a broader tradition of thinking about what happens to divine elements that enter into contact with the lower world. This is not the Enochic tradition directly, but it occupies the same theological territory. The question of what happens to something of divine origin that enters the realm of the dark and the broken. In this framework, the lunar knowledge Sariel carried, sacred, celestial, ordered, is exactly the kind of spark that could survive the fall. The knowledge itself is not corrupted by its transmission in a transgressive context. The moon's courses remain the moon's courses. The sacred calendar remains sacred. The spark, so to speak, maintains its light even through the dark transmission. The healing associations that cling to Sariel's name across centuries of popular tradition also speak to this theme of the sacred surviving transgression. The being who fell from heaven and brought knowledge into the human realm, including, perhaps, knowledge of the body's relationship to celestial cycles, of the moon's influence on health and season, continued to be remembered as a source of healing. In many pre-modern medical systems, including those practiced across the ancient Near East, health was understood in relation to celestial timing. The right moment for treatment, for surgery, for particular remedies, was determined by the state of the moon, the position of the stars. The lunar calendar was not merely a festival calendar, it was a medical calendar. If Sariel taught the courses of the moon, he taught something that ancient and medieval practitioners would have understood as directly relevant to the healing arts. The persistence of healing invocations to Sariel in Aramaic magical texts and incantation bowls is not superstition accidentally attached to a fallen angel. It is the memory of a specific domain, preserved in practice long after the theological texts had complicated the name's status. We must be precise here about what the tradition does and does not claim. There is no verse in 1 Enoch, in any surviving apocryphal text, in any canonical scripture that says, Sariel was forgiven. There is no divine decree in any text we possess that reverses the judgment on the watchers specifically for Sariel. The phrase, the angel God forgave, is not found in ancient manuscripts. If you are looking for that verse, it does not exist, and anyone who claims to quote it is inventing. This is critical to state clearly, because the history of religious pseudepigraphy is full of invented verses and fabricated sources, and this kind of material deserves better than that. What the tradition does offer is something more interesting than a single verse. It offers a trajectory of collective memory that could not decide how to condemn him, a trajectory in which his name kept migrating from the fallen list to the holy list, a trajectory in which the nature of his specific transgression distinguished him from the instruments of violence and sorcery, a trajectory in which his name became associated with protection, healing, and the governance of those who sin. What collective memory does with a name across centuries can itself be a form of theological statement, even when no authoritative text ever makes the statement explicitly. The persistence of Sariel's name in the archangel lists, across multiple text traditions, in multiple languages, across more than 2,000 years of transmission, speaks to something that the tradition recognized but could not fully articulate within its existing categories. The categories available were binary, holy or fallen, faithful or condemned, above or below. Sariel does not fit cleanly in either column. The texts that placed him in both columns simultaneously were not confused. They were accurately reporting something about the tradition's memory that the binary categories were inadequate to contain. The theological tradition has, in fact, subsequently developed categories that could contain what Sariel represents, categories of purgation, of reformatory judgment, of the refining fire that changes the condemned into the reformed. But in the Enochic period, those categories had not yet been developed. The tradition recorded what it remembered and left the interpretation to those who came later. The Watcher's narrative in 1st Enoch was never simply about angels. It was always also about human beings who misuse sacred knowledge, who cross the boundaries between their proper domain and a transgressive one, who bring catastrophe through the coupling of power with desire unguided by covenant obligation. The Watchers are a theological mirror. Their fall is meant to reflect something about the nature of transgression itself, how it begins with seeing and desiring what is not ours to have, how it proceeds through oath and collective momentum, how it produces consequences that cascade far beyond the original act. In this mirror, Sariel reflects something specific. What happens when the transgression involves sacred knowledge rather than weaponized knowledge? His trajectory in the tradition suggests that the collective memory judged these differently, not because transgression is acceptable, not because the oath on Hermon was anything other than a catastrophic crossing of divine order, but because the nature of what was transmitted and the domain it occupied carried implications that the simple logic of punishment could not exhaust. There is one more source that must be mentioned before we close: the Dead Sea Scrolls text known as the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, or Shirot Olat HaShabbat. This remarkable text, found in multiple copies at Qumran, describes the heavenly liturgy in extraordinary detail: the angelic priests who serve in the celestial temple, the architecture of heaven, the praise offered in the divine throne room. It is a text of mystical elevation, of the human community aligning itself with the perpetual celestial worship of the angels. The songs do not name individual Watcher fallen angels by name, but they describe a heavenly community of angelic priests serving before the divine presence with perfect devotion. The vision of heaven they project is not one of permanent condemnation and darkness for all who transgressed. It is a vision of ongoing, perpetual, perfect sacred service. And within that tradition, the tradition of the celestial priestly service, the name Sariel, Sariel continues to appear in the archangel lists. The one who governs the spirits who sin is present in the sanctuary. The threshold figure is at the altar. The moon, which Sariel taught the courses of, continues to govern sacred time in every tradition that emerged from the ancient Near East. The Jewish lunar calendar still determines the dates of Passover, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. The Islamic calendar is entirely lunar. Ramadan, Eid al-Fitr, Eid al-Adha, all pinned to the moon's cycles. The Christian calculation of Easter depends on the intersection of the solar calendar and the lunar full moon after the spring equinox, a calculation that requires exactly the knowledge of the moon's courses that Sariel is said to have transmitted. Every year, billions of human beings structure their most sacred time by the rhythms of the moon. Every time the crescent appears that begins Ramadan, every time the community searches the horizon for the new moon that begins Tishri, every time the Church Council calculates the date of Easter, the courses of the moon that were taught from the heights of the heavenly world are being followed. The knowledge survives. It sanctifies. Whatever the circumstances of its transmission, the knowledge itself has served the sacred life of humanity for millennia. You have been standing at the threshold with Sariel for this entire journey. You have followed his name from the slopes of Mount Hermon, where 200 divine beings swore an oath that would shatter the antediluvian world, through the great judgment of 1st Enoch, where specific leaders received specific condemnations, and Sariel's name was somehow not among the individually damned. You have followed it into the archangel lists of 1st Enoch chapter 20, where it appears among the 7 who stand before God and govern the domains of the cosmic order. You have traced it through centuries of suppression, the narrowing of the angelic canon, the exclusion of first Enoch from normative scripture, the institutional restriction of named angel veneration. You have found it preserved in popular healing traditions, in Aramaic incantation bowls, in the Ethiopian Orthodox scriptural canon. You have found it waiting in a Qumran cave, preserved in desert silence for 2,000 years until a scholar's hands opened the jar. What does it mean that this name survived? In the logic of ancient religious transmission, survival is not accidental. Texts and names that communities found meaningless or dangerous were discarded. The rabbis actively suppressed books they found threatening. The church councils narrowed the angelological canon. Imperial religious authorities burned texts that contradicted sanctioned readings. And yet, Sariel persisted. Not in the spotlight, not in the center of the canon, but at the edges, in Ethiopia, in Qumran jars, in incantation bowls beneath the floors of Sassanid period houses, in the marginalia of medieval manuscripts, in the careful copies made by monks who knew they were preserving something the official tradition had decided not to celebrate. Persistence at the margins is its own kind of testimony. It says, there is something here that the official verdict cannot quite exhaust. There is a thread of meaning in this name that human communities have found worth preserving even when the institutions said to let it go. The concept of divine forgiveness in the Hebrew tradition is not primarily about legal absolution, a divine verdict that erases guilt as if the transgression never happened. The Hebrew word most often translated as forgiveness, salak, carries connotations of release and renewal, but it operates within a framework of consequence and covenant. When God forgives in the Hebrew Bible, the consequences of the transgression often remain. Moses cannot enter Canaan even after his transgression is addressed. David cannot build the temple even after his repentance. The forgiveness does not undo the consequence, it restores the relationship. It allows the transgressor to remain in the covenant community even while bearing the weight of what was done. If we apply this framework to Sariel, not as a claim the texts make, but as a theological lens for interpreting what the texts show, then what we see is not absolution, but something more like renewed covenant position. His name in the archangel list says, "Whatever happened on Hermon, this being has a function in the divine order. He has not been finally cut off from the divine economy. He governs the domain most relevant to what he experienced." We are not claiming that the Book of the Watchers secretly teaches universal angelic redemption. It does not. The text is clear that the fallen Watchers face a final judgment of fire. The trajectory of the Enochic tradition as a whole is one of escalating judgment on the forces that corrupted the antediluvian world. The flood, the binding of the Watchers, the destruction of the Nephilim. These are the text's own categories for what happened. We are claiming something more specific and more carefully bounded, that the tradition preserved in Best Enoch, chapter 20, and in the subsequent angelological traditions that drew on it, carries a memory of Sariel that does not fit the simple framework of the fall and condemnation of the other Watchers. That memory may reflect different source traditions in tension within the composite text. It may reflect a genuine theological tradition that the text's editors preserved without fully resolving. It may reflect an ancient recognition that the nature of transgression matters to the divine economy in ways that simple categorization cannot capture. But it is there. It is real. It has persisted across 2.5 millennia. The story they erased, partially, imperfectly, is the story of an angel who stood at the boundary and remained there. Not cleanly on either side, not in the triumphant company of Michael or Gabriel, but not in the absolute darkness of Azazel's desert pit either. The boundary figure, the threshold figure, the one who governs the spirits who sin. This is a position that requires knowledge of both sides. You cannot govern the fallen if you have only known the exalted. You cannot offer the spiritual framework for those in transgression if you have only ever existed in perfect compliance. The oldest traditions understood this. They placed Sariel at the threshold, not despite what happened on Hermon, but possibly because of it. The one who knows the descent is made guardian of descent. The one who carried sacred knowledge across a forbidden line is made guardian of sacred time. The moon's courses that he taught continue to govern the sacred calendar of half the world's religious practitioners. And his name, worn thin by suppression, preserved by the margins, recovered from desert caves, waits to be read by those willing to follow where it leads. Think about what it means to teach the courses of the moon. The moon does not stay fixed. It waxes and wanes. It moves through darkness toward fullness and back again. The new moon, the sliver of light appearing after 3 days of darkness, was itself, in many ancient traditions, understood as a form of resurrection, a return from absence. The Babylonian and Canaanite mythological traditions connected the moon with cyclical death and renewal, with the god who descends into the underworld and returns. The Hebrew tradition desacralized the moon. It is a created object serving a calendrical function, not a deity, but the underlying cosmological reality of its rhythm remained. Darkness, return of light. Fullness, retreat. Darkness, return. If Sariel is the angel of the moon's courses, he is the angel of cyclical return from darkness. He is the angel of the rhythm that makes the sacred calendar possible. He is, in the structure of his very domain, a figure whose governing principle is the return from absence. The theology of Sariel's domain is itself a theology of renewal. The Book of the Watchers ends with Enoch's great visionary journey, in which he is taken through the geography of the cosmos, the ends of the earth, the places of punishment, the mountains where condemned spirits are held, the paradise of the righteous, the center of the earth. In chapters 17 through 19, Raphael shows Enoch the prison where the fallen angels are confined, waiting for the final judgment. The fallen watchers are in darkness. Their spirits, having led humanity astray, are in the place of confinement until eternity, to the day of the great judgment in which they shall be judged till they are made an end of. Chapter 21 shows the prison from another angle, a void without sky or earth, terrible, awaiting the imprisonment of the stars and the heavenly host. The text is comprehensive in its vision of cosmic justice, but notice, it is also comprehensive in its vision of cosmic order. The 7 archangels who guide Enoch through this journey are his companions and interpreters. They walk with him through the geography of judgment and mercy. And among those 7, depending on the manuscript tradition, is Sariel. To walk with Enoch through the geography of cosmic judgment is not a punishment. It is a function. The archangels who serve as guides through the visionary journey of First Enoch are performing a service. They are mediating between the human capacity for understanding and the cosmic realities that exceed that capacity. If Sariel walks among them in this function, then the tradition has placed him in the role of mediator and interpreter of divine justice, the one who experienced the pull toward transgression and who descended, or whose name echoes that of one who descended, is among those who now help humanity understand the geography of divine justice. This is not redemption as erasure. It is reintegration as deepened function. The one who knows the territory from both sides is the one best equipped to guide those who need to understand it. the ancient world understood this logic. The reformed transgressor, the one who had crossed the line and returned, possessed a knowledge of the territory that the perpetually faithful could not have. Sariel's domain, over the spirits who sin, is a domain that benefits from having been, however the tradition understood it, on both sides of the line. We return now to the question we opened with: why is this story worth telling? Why trace the thread of a name through 2.5 millennia of suppression, variant transmission, theological ambiguity, and recovered manuscripts? Because the story of Sariel is ultimately a story about the limits of institutional memory. Institutions, religious, political, scholarly, make decisions about what to preserve and what to suppress based on the concerns and categories of their moment. The concerns of the Second Temple period rabbis who excluded 1 Enoch from the canon were real concerns. The proliferation of named angels did threaten to compromise the monotheistic framework in ways that required institutional correction. The concerns of the Council of Laodicea were real concerns. Named angel veneration was creating devotional practices that the institutional church found theologically problematic. These decisions were not made in bad faith, but they were decisions made at specific moments by specific institutions, and their long-term effect was to bury material that had carried meaning for centuries. The desert preserved what the institution discarded. The margins preserved what the center excluded, and Sariel waited. The 20th century recovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls changed the intellectual landscape of Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity more profoundly than any other archaeological discovery in history. Before 1947, scholars knew of 1 Enoch only through the Ethiopic translation and fragmentary Greek versions. After 1947, they had Aramaic originals, or near originals, recovered from the very community that had treasured them in the final centuries before the Common Era. The Qumran community was not a fringe sect by the standards of Second Temple Judaism. Recent scholarship has complicated the old identification of the community as exclusively Essene and proposed that the library at Qumran may represent a broader deposit of Second Temple Jewish literature brought there for safekeeping. What we found at Qumran is, in some measure, what the Judaism of the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE actually read, studied, and preserved. And among what they preserved, in multiple copies, was the Book of the Watchers, complete with the name of Sariel, in both the Fallen Watcher list and the Archangel list. The community that preserved the text did not edit out the tension. They carried both references forward. What does the tradition ultimately do with irresolvable tension? In the best cases, it holds it. The tradition of apophatic theology, the theology of what cannot be said, teaches that the deepest truths about the divine resist full articulation in human categories. The divine nature exceeds the binary of our categories. What is true of God may also be partially true of the cosmic beings closest to God. They too may exceed the simple categories of fallen or holy, condemned or faithful, damned or redeemed. Sariel occupies the space where the categories strain. He is the crack in the binary through which something more complex leaks into view. He is the evidence that the ancient tradition, at its most careful and honest, recognized that the divine economy is not exhausted by simple verdicts. The complex figure, the one who descended and yet persists in the archangel lists, the one who taught forbidden knowledge that was also sacred knowledge, the one who governs sinners with the authority of one who has known the territory, this figure refuses to be fully filed under a single judgment. He insists on complexity, and that insistence is, perhaps, his most enduring teaching. The moon rises tonight as it has risen every night for billions of years. Its courses are not governed by human categories of fallen or faithful. The new moon appears whether we call its celestial cycle sacred or forbidden. The sacred calendar it governs, in Jerusalem, in Mecca, in Rome, in Addis Ababa, continues to structure the most important moments of billions of human lives. Whatever happened on Mount Hermon in the mythic time before the flood, whatever oath was sworn among the divine princes who looked down and desired, whatever knowledge crossed the threshold between heaven and earth in that moment, the knowledge of the moon's courses survived. It survived the flood. It survived the judgment. It survived the suppression of the text that named its teacher. And if you were to stand tonight under the open sky, in a place dark enough that the stars are visible, and look up at the moon in whatever phase it holds, you would be participating in a rhythm of sacred time that has its roots in the most ancient accounts of the divine order. You would be following the courses that Sariel taught. So, the Book of the Watchers was written for a community in crisis, the Jewish community of the Second Temple period, navigating foreign domination, cultural pressure, the agonizing question of why the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper. The Watcher's narrative offered an answer. The suffering of this world has cosmic origins in a primordial transgression. The current state of things is not the divinely intended state of things. There will be a judgment. The imprisoned Watchers will face their final reckoning. The corrupted world will be purified. Justice will be done. This is the message of apocalyptic literature. The present is not the final word. The present, however unjust, is a chapter in a larger story that ends in divine vindication. Sariel fits into this larger story in a way that is not simply consoling, but genuinely complex. He is evidence that even within the narrative of primordial transgression, the divine economy operates with a differentiation that simple human categories of punishment and condemnation struggle to contain. The Most High knows the difference between teaching swords and teaching the moon. The tradition remembered the difference, even when it could not fully articulate what to do with the difference. We have arrived at the end of the journey the texts permit us to take. We have not invented a verse. We have not claimed a divine decree of forgiveness that no ancient source records. We have traced a name through its actual appearances in the oldest strata of the angelological tradition, and we have watched what the tradition did with that name across centuries of copying, suppressing, preserving, healing, invoking, archangel listing, cave storing, and desert silencing. The story that emerged is not the simple story of a fallen angel condemned to eternal darkness, nor is it the falsely triumphant story of an angel miraculously forgiven and restored to heavenly glory. It is a more honest and more interesting story. The story of a name that the tradition could not quite categorize, that kept migrating between columns, that persisted in the margins when it was excluded from the center, that carried its sacred domain, the moon, healing, the governance of sinners, forward through millennia of transmission that were not designed to preserve it. That is the real story of Sariel, and it is a story worth knowing. The names we are permitted to remember shape the world we are permitted to understand. When the institutions of religious authority decide which names belong in the authorized canon and which must be excluded, they are not merely making archival decisions. They are shaping the theological imagination of every generation that inherits their choices. The exclusion of Wart Enoch from the normative Jewish and Christian canons was not a catastrophic loss in the sense that the material was destroyed. The Ethiopian church and the Qumran jars ensured that it survived. But it was a shaping decision that narrowed the theological imagination of most Western religious thought about angels. about the nature of transgression, about the complex relationship between the divine and the fallen. For most of the last 2,000 years, the available theological categories for thinking about Sariel were simply not present in the mainstream tradition. The category of the complex angelic figure, the one who is both and neither, who persists on the threshold, was not available because the texts that carried that category were not in the canon. The Dead Sea Scrolls gave them back, and with them, they gave us Sariel. The category of the threshold figure, the being who belongs fully to neither side of a boundary, is one of the most powerful categories in religious thought across cultures. The liminal being, the one who stands between, carries a specific spiritual power precisely because of its ambiguous position. In the ancient Near East, the threshold of a house was a sacred space, the place where protective spirits were stationed, where incantation bowls were buried, where the boundary between inside and outside was managed by spiritual means. The threshold is not empty. The threshold is charged. If Sariel is the threshold figure of the Watcher tradition, the one who is present in the fallen list and the archangel list, who taught sacred knowledge through a transgressive act, who governs sinners with the authority of one who knows the territory, then his spiritual power, as understood by the popular traditions that continued to invoke his name in healing and protection, makes a kind of structural sense. You invoke the threshold guardian at the threshold. You invoke Sariel at the boundary between transgression and return, between sickness and healing, between the darkness before the moon and the light of its return. Chet. In the 2nd century CE text known as 3 Baruch, or the Greek Apocalypse of Baruch, there is a description of the heavenly journeys of the prophet Baruch in which angels appear as guides and the cosmological structure of the heavens is laid out in detail. The text names and assigns specific angelic functions with the kind of systematic angelological interest that characterized the Second Temple and early rabbinic periods. While Sariel does not appear by that name in 3 Baruch, the text is part of a broader literary environment in which the kind of complex angelic figure Sariel represents. The threshold guardian, the one who governs the spirits of those between states, was a recognized theological category. The apocalyptic literature of this period was obsessed with the geography of the afterlife, with the stations through which souls pass after death, with the angelic functionaries who govern those transitions. The role that Sariel occupies in 1 Enoch chapter 20, governor of the spirits who sin, is precisely the role that this literature needed, and that various texts assigned to various angelic names. He was not alone in occupying this category, but his name, more than most, carried the weight of a specific story. The specifically Aramaic incantation bowl tradition, which flourished in the Sassanid period among Jewish communities of Mesopotamia, deserves more sustained attention than it typically receives in discussions of ancient angelology. These bowls, fired clay vessels with spiraling magical texts written on their inner surfaces and then buried face down beneath the floors of homes and businesses, represent the popular religious practice of ordinary Jewish families who inhabited the world between the canonical tradition and the lived experience of sickness, childbirth, business failure, marital discord, and the fear of harmful spirits. They invoked angelic names as protective powers, not in formal liturgy, not in temple service, but in the immediacy of daily life where the need for spiritual protection was urgent and concrete. The name Suriel appears in several of these bowls in contexts of healing and protection against harmful spirits. These families did not have access to the fine theological distinctions being developed in the academies. They had inherited names and functions from a tradition deeper than the canonical decisions of any one council. And they remembered Suriel, Sariel, as protective, as healing, as the one who could help. One final source must be mentioned, the Sword of Moses, an ancient Jewish magical text of uncertain date, but clearly drawing on traditions of great antiquity, in which various angelic names are invoked in formulas of healing and power. The text, known in Hebrew as Haharba de Moshe, invokes a long list of angelic names in a cascading litany that reflects the full range of the ancient Jewish angelic tradition, including names from the Enochic corpus. Sariel and Suriel variants appear in traditions connected with this text in the literature of practical Kabbalah. The practical Kabbalah, the Jewish magical and healing tradition that developed across the medieval period drawing on ancient roots, preserved many names that normative rabbinic theology had formally sidelined. The practical tradition needed the names. It needed Sariel, the healer, the protective figure, the one who governed the spirits. This figure could not be simply erased from the tradition because the tradition needed what he represented. The need kept the name alive even when the theology had moved against it. The tradition is not only what the scholars decided, it is also what the mothers buried under their floors to protect their children in the night. As we conclude, let us return to Mount Hermon, the place of the oath, the place where 200 divine princes swore together to cross the line between their nature and the nature of the world below. Snow-capped, ancient, straddling what is today the border between Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. The mountain has been sacred since long before the Enochic tradition assigned it as the site of the Watcher descent. It was a high place, a sacred place, a threshold between the human world of valleys and cities and the divine world of heights and clouds. In the tradition of the ancient Near East, mountains were places where heaven and earth touched, where the vertical axis of the cosmos was accessible, where the divine and human could communicate across the boundary that usually separated them. Hermon was that kind of place, and in the Enochic tradition, it became the place where the communication went wrong, where the boundary was not bridged by divine permission, but breached by divine desire. The mountain remembers. The tradition remembers. And the name that was sworn there and that persisted in the archangel lists, and that was buried in desert caves and incantation bowls, that name remembers too. Sariel, Suriel, Sariel, Prince of God, the one over the spirits who sin, the teacher of the moon's courses, the angel of the threshold, the name the tradition could not finally condemn and could not fully restore, the name that waited in the desert and in the margins and in the healing traditions and in the Ethiopian canon, across 25 centuries for someone to come looking. If the measure of a name's importance is the persistence of its meaning despite institutional suppression, then Sariel is one of the most important names in the entire angelological tradition. Not because the tradition celebrated him, it mostly did not, but because the tradition could not erase him. Every attempt at suppression was partial. Every official narrowing of the canon left some door ajar. Every decision to remove the name from the center left someone in the margins still writing it down, still invoking it over the sick, still carving it into the stone of a hidden cave's collection. The name persisted because something in the tradition recognized that what the name represented could not be adequately captured by the verdict of condemnation alone. The tradition knew, even when it could not say so clearly, that Sariel was more than his fall. The moon is rising now over the same mountain where the oath was sworn. Its courses continue, as they have for billions of years, indifferent to the theological categories human beings have used to classify the one who taught them. The sacred calendar that depends on those courses is already orienting millions of human beings toward their most holy moments. Sabbath, new month, festival, fast. The knowledge flows forward through time in the ritual practice of communities who no longer know the name of its mythic source. In the Ethiopian highlands, a priest reads the Book of Enoch and encounters Sariel among the 7 archangels, and somewhere below the surface of his consciousness, the tension between the 2 appearances of that name works in him the way all irresolvable theological tensions work, opening the space of awe that no clean answer can provide. In a museum in Jerusalem, a scholar bends over an Aramaic fragment from Qumran and reads a name written by a hand 2,000 years gone. The name is still there. The meaning is still active. The threshold still stands. And the angel who governs the spirits who sin still holds his post at the boundary between transgression and return, between the darkness before the new moon and the first faint light of its reappearance, waiting, as he has always waited, for those willing to stand at the edge and look into the complex truth that simple verdicts cannot contain.